What happened in this house is going to shock you.
There's a dead body there.
Cops in Placerville, California say it's one of the most cold-blooded crime scenes in the history of this tiny town. 72-year-old Rob Harris shot in the head, dead in his bed. And you are not going to believe who did it.
Gonna find a single female.
Okay. What's
Her name's Colleen.
Colleen is the dead man's 70-year-old wife. The voice on the 911 call is her attorney, David Weiner.
There's been a homicide.
okay? What happened?
I can't tell you. I'm an attorney.
Bob and Colleen Harris had been married for more than 2 decades. Grandparents in their golden years, living the good life in the quiet little town of Placerville, California. So how did this picture-perfect life develop into these grisly crime scene photos and turn this sweet little grandma into a cold-blooded killer?
Colleen came to believe that Bob was planning on leaving her, and that was unacceptable to her. And so she waited until he fell asleep one night. She entered the bedroom and she shot him in the head with a 12-gauge shotgun.
Everybody loved Bob. He retired from the Forestry Service, volunteered with the Sheriff's Department, and umpired for the Little League World Series. Colleen was known as Grandma Cokie. On the surface, they looked like the perfect blended family. But Bob's son Andy says there was deep trouble brewing.
I got the indication that he was very unhappy with the marriage, and he wanted to take a break from it. And I think that's why he went to Mongolia in that particular time frame too, was to separate so he could think things through.
It was during one of those work trips to Mongolia, Bob apparently fell in love with a much younger woman.
Has your husband seen somebody else in another country?
Yeah, he has been.
During this interrogation, Colleen admits she hacked into Bob's computer, found love notes to the woman in Mongolia, and confronted her husband.
It took me 4 hours, but I got into his computer and I found some conversation that he had had with her.
These are actual pages from Colleen's personal journals, where she writes, "I am so devastated inside. I never thought I could ever be hurt so deeply. I loved Bob more than life itself." But District Attorney Joe Alexander isn't buying the broken-hearted Dear Diary act.
Personally, I don't think Colleen was driven by a sense of betrayal so much as a sense of ego. That if she wasn't going to have Bob, no one was going to have Bob.
Colleen was so angry, she actually packed up Bob's stuff and moved it to his cabin in Lake Tahoe, just before he got back from Mongolia for the last time.
He called me within a matter of days and said that he and Colleen were having marital problems and that he was going to live in Tahoe and she was going to live in Placerville, and that they would work on their issues, and that he thought everything would work out just fine and I wasn't to worry about it.
So if Bob moved out, how did he end up dead?
He moved back because Colleen had hip surgery and she needed someone to care for her at home. He felt an obligation to her to come back and to help her as she recovered from this hip surgery.
Colleen used Bob's kindness as one last shot to save their marriage.
Colleen viewed this time that they had together while she was recovering from her hip surgery as a chance to win Bob back. And as she was coming to the end of her recovery stage, where she wasn't going to need Bob's help, and it was clear that he was going to return to the cabin, she saw that she had failed. She hadn't won him back. And I think in her mind, that drove her to kill him.
Prosecutors say Colleen Harris shot her husband in cold blood because she overheard Bob having a conversation with his new girlfriend earlier that night. But during her interrogation, Harris told police it was all a blur.
It seems like it's like this real quiet, gray fog.
She talks about being in a fog and having no idea what happened.
And just listen to her defense.
I thought he was having a nosebleed.
She thought he was having a nosebleed. This is the same woman who put a double-barreled shotgun to her husband's head and pulled the trigger. This is the shotgun police say Colleen used to ambush her sleeping husband.
There's no doubt in my mind whatsoever that Colleen Harris killed Bob Harris as he lay sleeping in bed.
As the pieces of this investigation fall into place, a twisted tale of betrayal, jealousy, and what can only be described as selective memory loss emerges.
I know sometimes you have people that get amnesia and stuff.
And less than 2 hours into Colleen Harris's official police interrogation, another bombshell drops about this sweet little old lady. This is not her first shotgun divorce. Cops in the sleepy little town of Placerville, California, claim she shot and killed her 72-year-old husband, Bob, while he was sleeping in their bed.
There's been a homicide.
And talk about cold-blooded. Authorities say this 911 call didn't come in until at least 9 hours after Harris was shot dead. So why did it take so long for cops to get the call? You may need to sit down for this one. The prosecutor says Colleen took a 200-mile joyride to San Francisco and back to see her son.
We now know that Colleen shot and killed Bob sometime in the late evening or early morning. And we know that about 7:30 in the morning, she left Placerville and drove to San Francisco. And we're able to track her cell phone.
And Colleen took some of her dead husband's valuables with her to stash in her son's garage.
The items that she took to San Francisco included a large coin collection that filled 2 storage bins, a gun that belonged to the victim, Bob Harris, and we believe Bob Harris's cell phone.
After the drop, the brand new widow headed back to Placerville. Cops may never have found out about her dash and stash, but they got a break when Colleen's car broke down.
Fortunately for us, as she was traveling back from San Francisco, she had some car trouble and actually drove off the highway and called AAA. And when you call AAA, those calls are recorded. And as a result, we actually have the defendant's own voice on 2 separate calls to AAA.
Thank you for calling AAA. May I have your name, please?
Colleen Harris.
Yes, Miss Harris. Are you in a safe location?
She's able to say who she is and that she needs help.
I just started swerving on the freeway, and then all of a sudden I kind of did a complete flip, and then the car won't start now.
During her police interrogation, Colleen told cops that night was all a blur.
It seems like it's like this real quiet grave box.
But prosecutors say she sounded crystal clear when her car broke down.
I'm off of Highway 80. I can see a sign ahead of me that says UC Davis, Sacramento. I live in Placerville, so I have no way to get home unless I have the car.
Okay.
So, and I don't have anybody at home, so I'm just going to have to wait.
And she's able to describe her circumstances. And she's very clearly cognizant of what's happening to her, where she is. She's not in any sort of fog or mentally confused state whatsoever.
Once Colleen finally got back to Placerville and her dead husband's bedside, she did make a phone call, but it wasn't to the cops.
The first call that she makes when she returns to Placerville isn't to the police, it isn't for an ambulance. Instead, she calls her criminal defense attorney, David Weiner, and he actually comes out to the house and spends an hour and a half with her at the murder scene before law enforcement is ever notified that a murder has taken place.
Colleen told authorities she called her attorney first because she was distraught and on the verge of suicide.
She tried to portray it as though she was in fact suicidal and that he was counseling her to not harm herself. But it seems eminently unlikely based on the fact that Mr. Weiner then left her at the scene of this killing where he knew there was a functioning firearm, and the idea that he would just leave her if he really thought she was suicidal, I think is just incredible.
And how's this for a shocker? Colleen Harris and David Weiner have been through this before. This is not her first shotgun divorce. In 1985, Harris was accused of murdering her previous husband, Jim Batten. Killed him the same way, with a shotgun in bed. Guess who defended Colleen during that murder trial? Yep, David Weiner.
And her assertion in that case was that she had amnesia for the actual killing, and coupled that with what I would describe as a self-defense claim, that her husband was violently sexually assaulting her.
Here's the 911 call from that terrible night 30 years ago.
911. I need to hear. You're speaking to dispatch. Can I help you? I need someone to come down. What's the problem? I think I can help you.
You'd think the shame of that shooting all those years ago would drive Colleen Harris out of this small town, right? Wrong. In fact, the house where she shot her previous husband was right around the corner from where she ambushed Bob Harris. So why wasn't she already doing hard time? The prosecution back then went for first-degree murder or bust. The jury had no option of second-degree or manslaughter. Either find Colleen guilty of first-degree murder or let her walk. And walk she did. Right into the unsuspecting arms of Bob Harris, despite a warning from Bob's son Andy.
I said, Dad, I heard what Colleen did, and what do you think of that? How are you dealing with that? And he said, well, she had a hard life, and it was self-defense, and I love her, and I'm not going to let that stop me from marrying her.
That decision ultimately cost Bob Harris his life.
My dad was an incredible father and a great grandfather to my kids. Just a good role model overall.
Colleen's lawyer tried to keep that case of dead husband number 2 out of the trial of dead husband number 3. But the judge allowed it, and the jury convicted this sweet little old lady of murdering Bob Harris in cold blood.
We shall find comfort in knowing the defendant is in prison and cannot hurt anyone else. We encourage and support the maximum sentence, along with a lifelong sentence of unending sorrow, grief, sadness, heartache, and a void that we wake up to every single day.
Bob's daughter, Pam Sterling, got her wish. Colleen Harris will die in prison. She received a mandatory sentence of 50 years.
She should be in prison the rest of her life. That's where she deserves to be, and it will give me great peace if she never gets out of prison again to do this to anybody else.